Welcome to ODEON Capital Conversations on all things money and markets with Dick BOVE and Matt Van Alstyne. And here is your host, John Aidan Byrne.
On this episode, we look at the role played by the rapid jump in the nation's money supply in steering the US economy clear of recession at the start of the pandemic, the far-reaching implications of the reduction in the Federal Reserve's balance sheet by $940 billion in the past 18 months, changes in bank balances and consumer spending today, and what this could spell for the American economy. Dick BOVE has analysis and the numbers. Matt Van Alstyne weighs in with his views on a gathering financial storm. Is the American consumer financially prepared if interest rates were to climb as high as 7%? We'll examine the thoughts and warnings of JP Morgan's Jamie Dimon on this hypothetical scenario. Can US manufacturing make a comeback? We'll discuss. Is world disorder spreading fast? One analyst thinks so. Dick has more on the state of the US banking sector, and we'll turn once again to China and more. I'm with Dick BOVE, Chief Financial Strategist at ODEON Capital Group, and Matt Van Alstyne, ODEON co-founder and managing partner. And we'll be right back after this message.
Current and future holdings are subject to risk, and past performance is no guarantee of future results. This podcast should not be copied, distributed, published, or reproduced in whole or in part. Information presented herein is for discussion and illustrative purposes only and is not a recommendation or an offer or solicitation to buy or sell any securities. Securities identified do not represent all of the securities purchased, sold, or recommended to clients. The views and opinions expressed by the ODEON Capital Group speaker are their own as of the date of the recording. Any such views are subject to change at any time based upon market or other conditions, and ODEON Capital Group disclaims any responsibility to update such views. These views should not be relied on as investment advice, and because investment decisions are based on numerous factors, may not be relied on as an indication of trading intent on behalf of any ODEON Capital Group product. Neither ODEON Capital Group nor the speakers can be held responsible for any direct or incidental loss incurred by applying any of the information offered.
Dick and Matt, it's episode 88. You're very welcome. We've spoken on these podcasts about the economy, the possibilities of recession, our federal debt, the money supply. We've looked at the stories about imminent recession, and yet there is no recession out there, although one may still be imminent. And one answer as to why there is no recession is because the Fed has increased the nation's money supply by $3 trillion at the beginning of the pandemic, according to you, Dick, and its balance sheet exploded. I guess at one point it was over $8 trillion or more. The $3 trillion spending came during the COVID period, unprecedented in scale. But now the Fed has cut its balance sheet by $950 billion, or just over 10% in the last 18 months. And you say the game has changed, Dick. Money market funds are starting to lose funds. Banks continue to lose deposits. We're at a different point in the economy, and it could impact what happens from here on out.
Let me correct just two numbers. They increased the money supply by $6 trillion, and it reached a point slightly over $9 trillion. So that, basically the money supply increased by $6 trillion. The Federal Reserve balance sheet, which is different, went over $9 trillion. The Federal Reserve balance sheet has now been reduced by $940 billion, or 10.5%, back down to $8 trillion. So what I think is prevented the recession is the fact that when you increase the money supply by that magnitude, it's $6 trillion on a base of $15 trillion, so it's not a small increase. Then basically it takes a while for that money to filter through the economy, and I think that money, basically kept the economy from going into recession. The problem that we have now is that the Fed has reversed the size of its balance sheet, which is causing stress on the money supply. The money supply is now shrinking. And, even those portions of money which the Federal Reserve doesn't consider to be money supply, which would be money in money market mutual funds, that money is beginning to shrink. My view is that with the shrinkage now well underway in money supply, that it will result in a recession. And I noticed that now 60% of the economists out there are calling for a recession. And again, just to add on to what we said about Jamie Dimon's comments, as you've indicated, John, Jamie Dimon was in India this past week, and he doubled down on his predictions of relatively negative developments. Last week, we said he predicted $150 a barrel oil, sometime in mid-2024. Now he's also predicting a 7% federal funds rate. Tell you, if we have $150 oil barrels, and we have, a 7% federal funds rate, a recession is almost a definite. But he's convinced that the Fed will continue to fight against inflation, ignoring what the impact is on the economy, and therefore we will go into a very tough downturn. And by the way, obviously, I agree. I don't know whether we're going to have $150 a barrel oil, or which would be about $5.50 a gallon gas, or whether we're going to have 7% federal funds rate. But the nature of the consumer has changed very dramatically in a couple of fashions. Initially, when the federal government provided these stimulus programs, it went into the bank accounts of all of the households in the United States, and they used it to do things around their home because it was COVID, right? Home improvement was big, all right? When the vaccines came and consumers were able to get out of their houses, they switched from what were considered to be essential home improvement stuff to what I guess they have a new term for it called experienced expenditures. Experienced expenditures meaning, travel, eating at a restaurant, buying, a motorbike, something, of that nature. Now what is being noted is that they're going back to essential purchases. They're going back to not so much the experience purchases, but the things that they need for day-to-day life. That's one thing that we're seeing. The second thing that we're seeing about the consumer is that they're borrowing less. About a year and a half ago, credit card debt was rising at about 16% on a year-over-year basis. That's now down to 2 to 3%. Okay, so they're not borrowing as much. And the third thing that we're seeing about the consumer is that the delinquency rates on auto loans and credit card loans are expanding very, very dramatically. One report indicated that credit card loan delinquencies were now up over 3.5%, and that this has been the fastest increase in delinquencies ever seen in the data related to that particular subject. So I think we're well on the way to the recession, and I think that Matt said a week ago he thought it might be the fourth or the first quarter. I think he's probably right, whereas I'm saying the second quarter of 2024. But the fact of the matter is, things have changed. They've changed dramatically.
So we're headed nearer to that recession. He also said, Jamie Dimon, in that interview in India, that Americans are on an economic sugar high. And then he was also talking about the global situation. He said global fiscal spending is higher than we've ever seen, probably in the history of mankind, other than maybe World War II, and warned, of course, as you said, that interest rates could potentially go as high as 7%.
I just want to point out that Jamie Dimon, I think you called it a prediction. I think he wasn't using it as a prediction. He thought that was a worst case scenario, the 7% scenario. But he also said you should be ready for it because it's not anywhere close to being out of the realm of a possibility. And the gap between 3% and 5% was much easier to swallow than the gap between 5% and 7% on overnight rates. In terms of predicting when the next recession will come, there's a big joke that economists predict 10 of the next 1 recessions. And, you don't want to be out there predicting recessions because the economies tend to be more resilient than all of us expect, because we look at the numbers, and as you've rightly pointed out, the money supply has been drying up, but it's been drying up for quite some time. And the real question is, when does the lag begin? And I feel like we're really, really suffering from Jerome Powell's political games that he played in 2021. Because back then, I think even you and I were talking about how, the economy was overheating. And at that point in time, Joe Biden really was kind of under pressure to not appoint Jay Powell. They wanted him to appoint maybe the first female, not the first female, but a woman. I can't remember her name now, but it was a competition. And Jay Powell was under political pressure because he wanted to get reappointed by Joe Biden. Like, there's no stronger sign that you're an impactful Fed chair than to be appointed again by a president of the other party. And so he kept rates really, really low. And he kept them low well past when it was probably time to start raising rates and tightening the money supply, because there is a way to balance these things and make it so you're not overheating and you're not overcooling. And when you have a lag of the results, and the debate is the lag 12 months, is it 18 months, is it 30 months? Historically the number we've talked about when the yield curve inverts is that it's anywhere from 4 to 10 quarters away from a recession. Well, the yield curve inverted in 2021, in the summer of 2021. So the idea that Q1 or Q2 or Q4 coming up, it's all within that realm of plausibility that the yield curve inverted just at the right time. And then traditionally recessions happen, somewhere in between 16 to 24 months after the Fed starts tightening. And again, that lands right in that window, Q4 to Q2. So I think it's going to be, this fourth quarter and this first quarter. And it's just, we've got so many moving parts in the world right now. This week, the government's probably going to shut down. And it doesn't seem like there's a path for it to not shut down. And once it does shut down, it's hard to figure out what the path is for it to reopen. You have a land war in Europe. You have a presidential election where the incumbent president has arrested his leading opponent and prior opponent to make sure that he's being prosecuted during the election season. There's a lot of headwinds in this economy, not to mention Europe is basically shrinking and at risk of a recession. Germany's probably already in a recession. China, it sure looks like they're faking their numbers to make it look like they're not in a recession. So the entire world has headwinds, and it's hard to look around and be like, okay, where's the tailwinds that we avoid a recession? It's really hard to be optimistic right now.
The consumer, Dick, that you have spoken about, so their bank balances exploded during the height of COVID, and now they're spending down that money, and we've seen a figure of 500 billion, and that's been spent out. So the consumer is weakening. You're talking about headwinds there, Matt. A great piece in the Wall Street Journal today by Walter Russell Mead. World disorder is spreading fast is the headline. And he said the most important fact in world politics is that 19 months after Vladimir Putin challenged the so-called rules-based international order head-on by invading Ukraine, the defense of that order is not going well. The world is less stable today than in February 2022. The enemies of the order hammer away the institutional foundations of the order, look increasingly shaky, and Western leaders don't yet seem to grasp the immensity of the task before them. Just breakdowns everywhere, according to this piece by Walter Russell Mead. And he concludes on a very somber note: threatened by powerful and relentless adversaries from without, undermined by political decadence and institutional decay from within, the rules-based international order has not been this imperiled since the 1930s.
Yeah, I'm not sure I want to go as far as he's going, but I don't disagree with a number of his premises. I mean, clearly, to bring it down to one statistic, the value of the US dollar for the last couple of months has been rising meaningfully. It's rising meaningfully at a time that we're talking about shutting down the US economy, where we've got all of this political disarray in the United States, where people are talking about a recession in the United States. And you have to ask yourself, how in heaven's name can the dollar go up in value on a consistent basis with that type of, pressure to push it lower? And the answer, of course, is what you just listed, the fact that, we are probably in a recession already in Germany. We're in a situation where yesterday there were things on television showing the Philippine divers going out and cutting, ropes that were put up by the Chinese to stop the Philippines from getting to what both companies consider to be part of their nation. If you truly believe that there are different types of economic systems, the system we have, the system that, China now has, the system that, once existed in Russia, but what is now gone, then, this article that was in Foreign Affairs magazine, my Bible, basically indicates all of the ways that China is going to collapse on its own because of the inherent problems with its economic system. So, yeah, I think that we are in a very difficult period. And to be honest with you, I often wonder whether it's my age that makes me worry so much about what's going on at the present time. But it does seem that there are real threats out there. And it does seem that in 2024, we're going to start to see more actualization of those threats. So I think this guy may have gone a little bit too far, but I think his basic premise is correct.
Matt did clarify what Jamie Dimon did say. He's not predicting 7% interest rates. He said Americans are they prepared for it? And obviously it's a possibility. But so, Dick, you've noted also that mortgage rates are now at 8%, auto rates 8%, credit card rates at 22%. A lot more defaults on car loans. Credit card losses are rising at the fastest pace in many years, with balances over the 1 trillion mark. So if rates hypothetically rose maybe to 6 or 7, so presumably mortgage rates would follow and auto rates and credit cards, we would be in a total, absolute fiscal and economic mess in America.
But remember, those rates which you're mentioning were in existence for most of my lifetime. Okay. In other words, basically, the aberrational period is not going back to a 7.5% mortgage rate. The aberrational period is having a 3% mortgage rate. Because if you take a look at the statistics put out by the Federal Home Loan Mortgage Corporation on mortgages, which are now, considered to be the base rate that one looks at, 7.5% is pretty close to average. It is not obscenely high or unusually out of whack. 22% on a credit card is not out of whack either. In 2010, the Congress passed a law which limits, how credit card companies can increase rates on your particular account. I mean, you have to send a letter out in advance. You got to give people a warning of a certain number of months, but 29% is not unusual for a credit card loan rate. So we're not talking about getting to a period where rates are absurd relative to history. We're talking about getting back to the norm. And the problem is we are so far away from the norm over the last 5 years that basically it seems like we're headed for an aberrational period. We're not. And what Jamie Dimon is really threatening about is the rapidity at which we go from where we have been for the last few years to where we are going to be next year, and the economy can't absorb it in that faster period of time. And that's where he sees the threat coming from. And by the way, he doesn't make predictions. He always says such and such could be such and such, and that's his prediction. I mean, he doesn't want to be, nailed on the fact you said such and such, and you predicted such and such. So he gets around it in that fashion.
And yet, Dick and Matt, US unemployment rate of 3.8%, that's low by historic standards. Is there not some bright spots in the US economy to cheer about?
No, I was going to say there are bright spots, but we're not talking about present. I mean, when you're trying to figure out where are we going, that is the real question. The bright spots are before recessions, there's always low unemployment. Everything is fine before it breaks. It's always darkest before dawn, or always, maybe I'm doing the backwards analogy there. But just because, there's two ways of entering a recession, suddenly or gradually. And usually it's suddenly. The small recession in 2020 was government caused when the government decided to ask everyone to to stay home for 2 weeks that turned into 2 years. But the recession was overcome by enormous fiscal stimulus that made up for the normal economy not functioning anymore. The recession in 2007, 2008. I'm young enough to remember the summer of 2008, when the Fed kind of declared victory in the summer, and it wasn't until September when things took a turn. Black Monday in 1987 came out of nowhere. Recessions can come out of nowhere just because there's bright spots. What's interesting though, and this is where you kind of get into like subjective versus objective reality. Objective reality, if you accept the data, and I know we've had lots of conversations about the data, but let's just say for sake of argument, the data is right. We have very low unemployment. I was taught when I was in college that 5% unemployment, which at that point in time was, far off the radar, was basically full employment because there's generic churn in the system of roughly 5% at any given time. So anytime you get down to around 5%, you're at full employment. So that's the objective reality. We're at full employment. But then you look at the subjective reality, and there's polls, and Gallup does polls. ABC News had one over the weekend. NBC News had one over the weekend, where they ask people their feelings about the economy. And the feelings are extraordinarily negative. And I think a lot of that is due to the inflation that we've had since Joe Biden became president. Prices are broadly up 15 to 20 to 25%, depending on where you live across the spectrum, while wages, as much as your unemployment is low, wages have only crept up around 6 to 7 or 8%. And so there's this huge spending gap, income versus spending gap, that's creating this negative feeling out there, I think, that makes the economy much more dependent on the subjective analysis than the objective analysis. And so every time you look at the bright spots of the economy, you can counter it with, well, the reality on the ground is people don't feel like the unemployment number is low, or if they do, it doesn't really matter because their wages have been stagnant for the last 4 or 5 years.
And of course, Dick, you've also noted that manufacturing is not recovering in America. Now, we're talking about jobs, and yet the manufacturing sector is limping along despite all these bills, the CHIPS Act, Inflation Reduction Act. There is some groundbreaking on new factories, but it's just amazing. It's in decline. In your words, Dick, it sounds to me, US factory activity contracted this past summer for the 9th straight month in late summer, with the employment index at a 3-year low. I mean, the contraction in manufacturing in America seemed to have really accelerated in the period from 2000 to 2010 and continued on. And in that 10-year period, manufacturing jobs in America plunged 34%, a loss of 5.8 million jobs. So don't want to overuse it, but there is a crisis in the manufacturing sector, despite all the government spending and some areas where there is groundbreaking. It's not in a good state, Dick.
That's the most worrisome thing that I find. It's not all this consumer stuff that I just mentioned, but it's the fact that manufacturing is not recovering. It's showing a little improvement from where it was a couple of months ago, but the fact is it is not recovering. And it's still, if you look at the ISM numbers, it's still in a contractionary period. And what is becoming evident is that we need a lot more structural change in order to get us into a position where we manufacture goods in the United States and their cost is at the lowest point of product being manufactured anywhere else in the world. If we can't get to that point, manufacturing obviously will not recover. It will not recover to the level that we need to be at. So the question is, how do we get to that point? And I think, we're now talking about significant tax breaks for manufacturing companies, which would allow them to lower the governmental cost of manufacturing. I think you got to take a look at all these work rules that are in place and start to consider how many are absolutely needed and how many are simply driving up the cost of doing, business. We have to take a look at the pollution rules. We have to take a look at, the fact that, this UAW strike. How can, and I don't want to say that these workers don't deserve a meaningful increase in their wages, particularly since their bosses did get a meaningful increase in their wages. But let's assume everybody gets the increases that they want. How do we sell a Buick relative to, any car coming from overseas. Chinese automobiles are now starting to be among the fastest growing consumed around the world. We can give all of these people the increases in wages that they want, but we can't give them those increases in wages. We can't have the pollution control, that we have in place, that we want to put in place. We can't have the work rules that we want in place. We can't have the taxation policies that we have in place and say that, yeah, we can produce the lowest cost products in the world. And the other thing is, we really do have to step on the gas concerning artificial intelligence, because we've got to find a way to get the cost of manufacturing down. And until, we take a look holistically, to use a word from the past, until we take a holistic look at manufacturing in the United States, isolating the issues and coming up with, significant solutions, we're not going to get manufacturing where we want it to be, where it has to be. Historically, I constantly remember that when, manufacturing, we get into this position, we get huge tax breaks for big increases in depreciation on the purchases of machinery and other goods. There'd be huge tax breaks for research and development expenditures. We're not seeing any of that now. No one is focusing on the fact that this is a consumer-driven economy, and the consumer is driven by debt, and that does not work over the long term. All they're saying is, gee, the United States economy is doing well, and the new Apple, I always pick on Apple, the new Apple 15 is now selling much faster than the 14 was selling, that there are lines outside the stores again to buy this Apple 15. We're so focused on consumption and not production, because where does Apple build those phones? They don't build them in the United States. They're very unhappy with the way the Chinese are treating them. So are they looking to build something in the United States? No, they're looking in India. They're looking in Vietnam. And given my age, going to Vietnam is almost a curse. But the point is, because, I was drafted. But the point is that they're not looking to build them in the United States. We can't keep borrowing money to consume products that are built in other nations and at the same time fail to build products in this country. To do that is, in my view, disaster. And that's what we do. And that's what I think really has to change.
You did say, Dick, I have to bring this up, in earlier episodes, that you saw a coming manufacturing renaissance in America, but it seems like a long ways off now.
Yeah, and it's, I did more than say it. The stock recommendations I made, which I won't discuss here, but the stock recommendations I made were all built around the theory that manufacturing would recover, and those companies that provided services to manufacturers would be the best. I look at financial companies that would be the best beneficiaries of that. Manufacturing didn't recover. These companies are not recovering the way the ones that I liked were not recovering at the way I thought. So, I find it, well, number one, I was wrong. But number two, I find it very concerning, because I believe it must happen if the United States economy is going to, control the world the way it did in the past, because it was the lowest cost producer of the finest goods in the world. That's where we got to get back to. And we're not there. And we're not there. And we're not even seeming to be moving in that direction.
Do you think it takes a new level of American patriotism, buy American, made in America? Because I'm somewhat skeptical about that. If you put two identical goods on the shelf in Walmart, one of them made in America at a slightly higher price and labeled made in America, and the other made in China at a lower price or much lower price, I think the American consumer would go for the one at the lower price.
Yeah, he obviously will. No, I'm not saying, we should have a Buy American program, which I think is ridiculous. What I'm saying is we should produce goods in the United States which are competitive, both on a price basis and on a quality basis with the products produced around the world. Every time I get the Consumer Report auto issue, it makes me furious, because they can never find an American-made car that they're going to rate the way they rate cars that are made in Japan. European cars don't get high ratings anymore. But I mean, the fact of the matter is, that's the issue. Why should I go buy an American car, which is going to break down more, which is going to require higher repairs, which costs more, if I can buy a better car that costs less, that doesn't break down as much? The solution to the problem is we are making those cars in many cases in America, but they're not being made by American companies. But we've got to find a way to, to determine how we're going to do that. In listening to all the stuff about the UAW strike, all I'm hearing is, how brilliant the labor guys are in terms of their, hitting, here, there, and the other place, kind of like in a war. You hit this, area, then you go hit that area, then you hit this area. What I'm not hearing is what is it that the United Auto Workers and the producers of these cars, what is it that they're doing which is going to lower the cost of American vehicles to that of foreign vehicles? And what are they doing to ensure that the quality of the American vehicle is going to be as good or better than the foreign vehicle? When is American cars going to show up at the top of all the Consumer Report ratings of what are the best cars to buy in this country? No one's talking about that. That's what they should be talking about. Instead, they're saying, this guy got a 20% raise. Why the hell can't we get a 20% raise? Since we're producing the stuff and he's just sitting up there, enjoying the benefits of our production. That's not positive discussion. A positive discussion is, this is what we think we can do to lower the cost of the car, to offset the increase in income that we're seeking. This is what the company thinks it can do. Those are the things that should happen. What is likely to happen is they're going to get a big raise, and then, the American car makers are going to go back to Mexico and start building more cars in Mexico. I mean, it's the wrong direction.
I feel whenever you're talking about Apple and how they make their iPhones overseas, I find myself nodding along, because the famous conversation between Tim Cook and Donald Trump, where he was like, what do I have to do to get you to make an iPhone in America? And Tim Cook's response was, and this is back when iPhones were under $1,000, was basically get American consumers prepared to pay $2,500, because that's what it's going to cost to make an iPhone in America, because our labor is way more expensive. The fact is, international trade enhances the quality of life for the people that benefit from it, and we benefit from cheap labor overseas because we get higher quality products from it. When you switch into the auto sector, I find myself kind of getting a little bit queasy, because BMWs, most of the BMWs sold in America are made in America at non-union factories in the South. Most of the Japanese Honda imports and Toyota imports are made in America in the South. You talked about how American cars aren't highly rated in America. I pulled up the Consumer Reports. The number one car they recommend is a car called the Ford Maverick. I don't know what it is, but they say it's the number one car to buy in America in 2023, the best car you can buy. Number 4 on there is Tesla. Number 5 is Tesla. These are American-made, American-designed cars. The analogy between iPhones and cars just doesn't carry over, because the reason cars in America are able to be made much cheaper in the South is because of the UAW's non-presence there. I think that what the UAW is doing, I listen to their arguments, and one of the things they say is, we want a 40% pay raise because that's what management got since our last contract. They got 40% increased pay since we had a new contract. We want that 40% increased pay. I kind of sit there and go, yeah, I get that. And then you just hit the nail on the head, which is the alternative for them is to ship these jobs down to Mexico or open up factories in the South. So you do have different levels of bifurcation. One of the reasons auto manufacturing is so protected in America is because of tariffs. It is not possible for a foreign truck maker to make a truck that can be sold in America competitively because of a 25% tariff on trucks. Do tariffs work? Is it good or is it bad? I personally don't care for tariffs. I think we should have free trade and let the market decide. But it does work in protecting American jobs. When it comes down to cell phones, that's a different story. I mean, this is kind of the if you start putting tariffs on everything and start making it so that phones from China cost $2,500 as well, so we can buy phones here or can make phones here at a competitive price. Well, what you're doing is you're actually artificially inflating the cost of the service, because what happens when you put up barriers to the natural price. If it's in a tight enough range, you can get away with it. But the difference between $1,000 phone and a $2,500 phone would lead to a massive black market of importing either Chinese-made iPhones, or maybe you would start trying to smuggle in Huawei phones, which are extremely capable. They're faster, they have better cameras, they have bigger screens, they're brighter, their batteries last longer. They're higher quality phones than Apple, but they're banned here, so we don't get to have them. But the iPhones are close enough that you don't create this black market. I mean, it's almost like this whole idea of be careful what you wish for. You know, like in New York City, when they slapped, I don't know the dollar price, but it's something like $10 a pack on cigarettes, a tax on cigarettes. All of a sudden, you started having this whole underground black market of cigarettes priced competitively as if you had driven to Connecticut or New Jersey. Because at some point in time, you can only do so much before economic reality takes over and the black market comes through. So I do see your point in all of this, and I think the solution is not tariffs or taking proactive steps to harm trade. The solution is to support innovation and support the type of things. And I think the CHIPS Act was, as much as I have a lot of issues with the hidden language in it, the idea that we're going to bring chips manufacturing back to the United States, and it's an important thing. It's like the new oil. To me, that seems like a version of America where we're looking towards the future and saying, okay, what's important and how do we get it here? I don't know that the auto manufacturers are the best example of it, because to me that seems, like when the foreign cars are being made here and it's just the profits are going overseas. Well, we're the China manufacturing the car for our consumer at a lower price than they can make it in Europe or Asia, and it works.
Well, number one, I definitely do not believe in tariffs, and I never said anything about believing in.
Oh, I didn't mean to impute that on you.
And number two, what I've said is we've got to develop the systems to create the products at lower price. It didn't say that we should have a Buy in America program or a tariff. So what I'm saying is we need tax abatements, let me repeat. We need changes in the pollution laws. We need changes in the work laws. We need changes in the depreciation laws. We need more incentives for research and development. We need changes in all those areas. We need more artificial intelligence to be put in effect into our factories. They're building these cars in America, but the components that go into the car are being made in Japan or other places. So that what happens is Honda buys all of the products that go into the car, not from American, metal benders in the Midwest. They're buying them from, Japan. So we're assembling this stuff in the United States, but we're not manufacturing it here. My problem is that we borrow money to consume products that are built elsewhere, and that the solution to that problem is that we've got to put in place systems in the United States to where we can produce better products at the lowest price. I think if you get a hold of Consumer Reports magazine, and you take a look at category by category, you're not going to find the Ford Maverick at the top of the list.
This might seem like an elementary question, but you can explain it to me, Dick and Matt. Is there any sense that there's a currency play here? In other words, is the dollar too strong to begin with? If you notice in recent months, the dollar index, and you take the euro versus the dollar, they're almost at par again. So if the dollar was weakened, we hear about the Chinese manipulating their currency. Whether it's true or false is another story. Is the dollar too high, in other words, if it was adjusted so that it would be much more attractive for these foreign countries to take air imports, and it would be more difficult for us there would be a disincentive, as it were, for us to import? Does the markets work much differently than that?
If you're going to reduce the value of the dollar, you're going to increase inflation. So how much inflation do you want in order to achieve the goal that you're seeking? Manipulating the currency, in my view, is not the solution. All of these systems, government-driven systems which manipulate values, in my view, are not the solution. We got to be producers at the lowest cost at products which are the highest quality. And that's not what we're doing.
We're going to get to the banks in a moment, Dick, but I just want to quickly go back to a note you put out there on your favorite publication, Foreign Affairs, why China will self-destruct, and you cite some of the reasons quoting from Foreign Affairs. Endemic corruption, environmental degradation, slowing growth, capricious shifts in government policies, inefficient enterprises, fraudulent stats, a rapidly aging population, enormous overproduction, huge youth unemployment. That's a recipe for just complete disaster in China.
Well, in other words, what we're talking about is which system works best. In other words, is the system that we have, despite all the things I said about manufacturing, is the system that we have a better system than the system that they have? Because if it is, ultimately, China will not overtake the United States in terms of production. China will not become the number one country in the world in terms of wealth. They may be number two in terms of their production numbers that they put out, assuming that the numbers are halfway correct. But they are number 87th in terms of per capita income, in the world. So the net effect is they have a system which I don't think, well, at least the people who wrote this article in Foreign Affairs don't think, and I don't think works. We did not defeat Russia because we went on a battlefield against them, because we, closed off the world, for their goods and services. We beat Russia because Russia collapsed internally. Their system was no good. Communism doesn't work. It's no good as a system. Dictatorships don't work. It's no good as a system for developing economies. And that's what caused Russia to fail. That's where China's, if you will, if weakness exists, and that's what's going to cause China to fail. We don't have those two problems. We don't have a dictatorship, and we aren't, we are setting a lot of rules in manufacturing, not to be a hypocrite, but we are not yet in a system in which it's all top-down rules as opposed to up from the bottom demands, up from the bottom, innovation, or up from the bottom, technology. I mean, we still got that system, and we're still better than they are. And therefore, they are going to collapse of their own weight, and I don't believe we are.
The question then is, what will replace this China if it self-destructs? That could be an equally scary scenario. Will it be a democratic system or authoritarian system? Maybe not with a communist tint, but with something maybe worse.
Well, this thing about India always makes me wonder, or the creation of what is now called the Global South, because to assume that, let's say that India is easier on Muslims than China is would be obviously a major misstatement. To assume that India is not almost, a state driven by religion the way Iran is. Yeah, they're not Iran, they're not China, but they do have one religion which dominates the political system there. They do have massive, deaths occurring because of, the willingness to what is Canada now is arguing about how they killed the Sikh leader in China, in Canada. I think India is more of a threat than it is, a potential ally against China. The article in Foreign Affairs is saying, don't worry about containment. Don't worry about trying to control everything. Just let our system work versus their system. Their systems don't work, and therefore we will win. And I believe that. And I believe that's what is true about what caused Russia to collapse, and it will be what is now causing, I think, China to start to collapse.
Dick, we spoke about the new capital rules that are being proposed and drafted and will be rolled out at some point for the US bank system. You spoke about shrinkage in the bank system and lots of stress on various banks depending on their size. Any individual stories of banks getting through this, succeeding, maybe really feeling the strain?
The banks are in trouble in the United States. In other words, a piece that I'm going to write this week is going to detail what I think is the collapsing of the banking system in the United States. Because first off, I think that, again, not to keep using his name, but Jamie Dimon asked the question, if I could only understand where the government is coming from, I would know what to do about it. Well, it's clear where the government is coming from. The government just last March had to deal with 3 bank failures that were created by the government. What the government realized when it looked at those 3 bank failures is that there was no way that we have enough protections that would allow us to insure all of the money in the banks in the United States. I mean, the president of the United States said that we do, but he was lying. And the Secretary of the Treasury said that we do, but she was not telling the truth either. So the net effect is what they understand in the regulatory area is that we've got this massive risk to the American government, the American financial system, which is the United States guaranteeing banks all around the country against losses and against deposit withdrawals. And the taxpayer is at the base of the protection that we're giving all of these financial systems, and they can't do it. Taxpayer doesn't have the money, the government doesn't have the money, and we cannot guarantee all of the deposits in the American banking system. Forget the ones that are uninsured. We cannot guarantee the ones that are insured. If you're the government and you see that you've got this huge risk out there, that you can't get out of the risk, how do you deal with the problem? Well, what you do is you start to force the banks to shrink. And that's exactly what they're doing. They're creating changes a little bit complicated, but they're creating changes in the risk weighting of loans that the banks made. For example, before these rules, which are not yet put in place, but before these rules were put in place, a bank only needed to have 50% capital up against, a mortgage, a home mortgage. The new rules say, forget, the 50% situation. Take a look at what the loan to value ratio is. And if the loan to value ratio is more than 80%, then you don't get that benefit by making a mortgage. Your capital requirement is going to be just as high as if you made an auto loan. So essentially, what I just said doesn't matter in terms of the specifics. What they're saying is mortgages are no longer going to get the subsidy in terms of capital benefits from the government. The banks are going to have to pay full bore. All right. So going through the loans which the banking industry has outstanding, and they're saying, wait a minute, this is a high risk loan, therefore the capital requirement is higher. This is a low risk loan, therefore the capital requirement will be lower. The problem is they're not finding things to say lower, it's all higher. So the government is attempting to protect itself by adjusting the rules so that it is not guaranteeing as much risk in the banking system as was the case. All right, now the second issue is the banks themselves. If you take a look at the prices of the bank stocks in the United States, and again, this does not, JP Morgan does not fall into this group, JP Morgan being the company run by Jamie Dimon. But in 4 of the past 5 years, and actually going back 6 years, but I only do 5 years what I write, in 4 of the past 5 years, bank stocks went down in what was a roaring market on the upside. Over the 5-year period, the bank stocks went down. So you would have to say, why? Why can't bank stocks go up as much as the average American stock? And the answers are very clear. Number one, the companies were giving away capital. Managements were giving away their capital and getting nothing in return for it by buying back stock. And you say, well, but, doesn't that increase stock prices? Well, if the stock prices went down for 4 out of 5 years, went down over a 5-year period, and you just gave away $400 billion in your capital, that's a pretty massive failure on the part of managements. Second thing is that the banks keep losing market share to non-banks. Non-banks, which are more innovative, which have higher costs of operations in terms of their cost of money than banks are, they're taking market share away from the banks. The rule that Walter Russeell set up when he created Citigroup as a holding company, which is we can get into a whole bunch of financial businesses which are not banking, taking the same risk in the financial businesses as everybody else, and we can grow our companies. The bankers threw that out. They're not doing it. So that's bad management. They have not figured out a way to compete in the marketplace. They have been giving away their capital. The government is attacking them in terms of, making the rules for them to lend money much more difficult, which means that the American banking system is in fact in trouble. It's in a great deal of trouble. It's not in a trouble of collapsing and people are going to lose their money. It's in trouble because it has got to contract. And as it contracts, the stock prices continue to go down. I mean, what industry can you point to that has 5 years in which their stock prices go down in 4 of the 5 years and for the whole period at a time when the stock market is supposedly in the greatest boom that we've seen, who knows, in history? So, there is something basically fundamentally wrong with these companies. There's something basic fundamentally wrong with their managements. There's something basic fundamentally wrong with their boards of directors because they're letting it happen. They are not protecting the bank stockholder. The UAW is complaining. You guys made this big increase, as managers of this company. Well, what about us, the stockholders of banks? We're losing money every year. We're losing money, and you're increasing the amount of money that you pay yourselves. That's not viable. That's not right. And I would assume if these bank stocks continue to fall, that there's going to be significant management changes in these companies because there must be.
What would you be doing different, Dick? And that's my first question. My second question is this part and parcel of just trying to slow down the economy and a more effective way of reducing money in the money system, or maybe not more effective, but an off the radar way of reducing money and trying to slow down the economy?
You're absolutely right. That's exactly true. All right. In other words, the reason why the Federal Reserve will go along with all of these more draconian rules on banks is because they realize that, they can slow down the economy if they stop banks from lending money. And therefore they're doing it. But that's sidestepping your basic question. What would we do different? All right. First, how does a bank make money? First, it has to get capital. Let's assume the bank gets $100 in capital. It takes that $100 and it's able to borrow 10 times against 100, which means they can borrow $1,000 against 100. Now they got $1,100. They take that $1,100 and they lend it out. And the beauty of banking is they don't sell the product. The loan is the product. They don't sell that product. They lend that product, which means at the end of some discrete period, all that money comes back to them and they can relend it. And it comes back again and they can relend it. And that process goes over and over. So if they increase their capital, if they lend it out and they continue to increase the rollover of the money with shorter term loans, then basically that eliminates this problem. The problem of, taking the capital and giving it away instead of putting it to work in the company. The second thing is they lack innovation because they are legacy companies and they get legacy systems in place. They don't want to compete with themselves. This book, The Innovator's Dilemma, and I forget the name. This guy comes from Harvard. One of the most brilliant things I've ever read in my life. It's up there as probably the number 1 and number 2 books that I've ever read. In The Innovator's Dilemma, he explains clearly companies that have legacy systems in place are loath to attack those systems. They want to protect those systems. They want to protect what they've got. So they don't do the innovative things. And he uses mainframe computers against, laptop computers at the time he wrote the book, saying the companies that made mainframe computers wanted to make bigger, stronger, better. And yet, they got killed. IBM got killed by Apple, by companies that came up with smaller computers that were limited in use. Then they talk about big machinery. He talks about big machinery and how the big machinery companies did the same thing, and they got killed by companies that came up with more innovative products. The banks today are losing market share to the innovators like SoFi. Well, we don't recommend a relationship to it, but they're getting killed by companies like that have bitten off small pieces of the market with smaller products. The banks could have done that. The banks, there's no limitation on banks setting up finance companies which are not funded by the bank. That's what was Walter Wriston's vision. His vision was, we will set up a holding company. That holding company will create all of these small companies that will compete in the market, and the bank will continue to do what the bank does. Well, these banks are not doing that. All right. So they're starting to do that in, processing and movement of funds and using technology heavily in that area, but they're not doing it. So the banks, number one, are giving away capital, which is the biggest capital sin that they could have. Number two, they're not innovative by setting up these fintech companies, inside of their holding company. Number three, they're allowing these laws to get passed instead of giving up certain of the government guarantees to get the government off their back. There's a bunch of things they can do, none of which they're doing, and therefore the stockholder keeps paying the managements of these companies more and more every year, and the stockholder loses money every year because the price of the bank stock keeps going down.
The innovator's dilemma was by the Harvard professor and businessman Clayton Christensen.
Yeah, Clayton Christensen. He set up through Harvard. He wrote something like 7 of these books. He set up an institute for showing companies how to, deal with the innovator's dilemma. And basically, unfortunately, he died of cancer about 3 or 4 years ago, which was a huge loss because he's an intellectual giant. And that book should be read by everyone, particularly everyone who runs a bank.
Picking you up on that, Dick, some banks have innovated, as I understand it. Goldman Sachs acquired or created or whatever Marcus, and that never worked very well. Wasn't that a kind of some level of innovation? Is it that simple to innovate if you're a bank and staid and stodgy and traditional? Well,
again, Goldman Sachs is not staid, stodgy, and traditional, but you got to pick the slots you're going after. The deposit industry has been around for hundreds of years. The loan industry has been around for hundreds of years. There are systems and things that are set up in these areas. And Goldman Sachs said, look, we can do it better. We can take on the consumer finance business in the United States and do it better because we have superior, technology. First off, they did not have superior technology. The banks have got the best technology in that area of anybody. So they picked the wrong target, but they had the right theory. The theory is, we build our business every day. When we come to the office every day, we have to rebuild the whole business every day. And we're sick of that. We want recurring revenue streams. Loans are recurring revenue streams. Deposits are recurring revenue streams, right? In a different fashion, but they create recurring revenue streams. So what Goldman Sachs says is we want these recurring revenue streams, but they went at it, by taking not the way a SoFi does or a whole bunch of these fintechs do. They went at it by going after the biggest, with massive amounts of money and massive, the General Motors is their partners, Apple is their partner. They went at it in the wrong way. And they get killed. So they went back now to the things that they do best. They are the very best at the stuff that they do, and they'll rebuild the company on that basis. But it's a shame because they had the right theory. They took the wrong approach to implementing that theory.
Dick and Matt, we're at a time. We'll come back next week to the banks, to the economy, the Federal Reserve, and much more. And until then, until episode 89, take care.
Current and future holdings are subject to risk, and past performance is no guarantee of future results. This podcast should not be copied, distributed, published, or reproduced in whole or in part. Information presented herein is for discussion and illustrative purposes only and is not a recommendation or an offer or solicitation to buy or sell any securities. Securities identified do not represent all of the securities purchased, sold, or recommended to clients. The views and opinions expressed by the ODEON Capital Group speaker are their own as of the date of the recording. Any such views are subject to change at any time based upon market or other conditions, and ODEON Capital Group disclaims any responsibility to update such views. These views should not be relied on as investment advice, and because investment decisions are based on numerous factors, may not be relied on as an indication of trading intent on behalf of any ODEON Capital Group product. Neither ODEON Capital Group nor the speakers can be held responsible for any direct or incidental loss incurred by applying any of the information offered.